welcome everyone to a new session of Digital Debates. Yesterday, we marked the 11th anniversary of the Syrian war. As of this year, 14.6 million Syrians are in need of humanitarian assistance, and 6 million of them are children. The current economic outlook is very grim, with the soaring prices of basic goods, currency depreciation, coupled with the unintended consequences of sanctions. In this session, we will discuss the humanitarian situation in Syria, focusing on topics such as the challenges faced in aid efforts, effects of sanctions, the early recovery projects, and prospects of lasting political solutions. To do so, I am joined by two distinguished gentlemen, Mr. Mark Kutz, who is the United Nations Deputy Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for Syria Crisis, and Dr. Karam Shah, Research Director of Operations and Policy Center. Unfortunately, today Dr. Basma Kodmani will not be able to join us due to an emergency situation. I would like to start with you, Karam. I made a very brief introduction, but can you tell us about the latest situation in Syria, highlighting the economic outlook of the country? What are the factors that have worsened an already difficult humanitarian situation, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and where are we headed to?
The humanitarian situation in Syria and the economic situation as well have never been worse since the conflict started in 2011. And this might sound actually counterintuitive to some people because the level of violence has actually declined over the past 2 years. So it's just that factor, that is the level of violence has declined. However, many other shocks have hit the economy and Syria in general over the past 2 years. And here you can think of maybe starting from the Lebanese banking crisis, and then the tightening of US sanctions and the introduction and then implementation of the Caesar Act, the COVID-19 pandemic, the feud between Bashar al-Assad and his cousin Rami Makhlouf, and many other shocks. So those have actually caused significant damage to the economy and people's livelihoods. And if you look at the situation currently, I think, or especially over the past maybe few months, you had one more thing added to the mix, which is a very severe drought hitting the country. That actually is likely to make what happened in the mid-2000s, the drought of the mid-2000s, look like a very mild drought. So where are we headed? We might be actually headed toward a famine. And this is because of, again, a combination of factors. So you have a very, very weak starting point. And then you have, on top of this, a decline in funding to the humanitarian situation in Syria. And the World Food Program, for example, had to cut down on its number of calories consecutively a few times. And then you have soaring prices driven by local factors, such as the drought, but also international factors. So prices are actually at their highest level in over a decade. Which actually takes me to your to the second part of your question, which is the impact of the latest conflict and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That is actually likely to make the situation yet worse, and primarily because of the impact on wheat prices and other food commodities, such as various types of like oil and foodstuffs. So that is also playing a role. The situation, the outlook looks very, very grim, unfortunately.
You touched briefly upon the sanctions, but and you said the sanctions imposed by US and Europe against the Assad regime are still in place. I'm wondering, so far, in your opinion, have these sanctions been effective? If not, what have been the shortcomings, and how can their unintended consequences on the civilian population be addressed?
I mean, this is such a contentious topic, and it's kind of almost impossible for you to get the same answer from two different people considering it. I mean, I think we should all agree that sanctions do hinder humanitarian efforts. They do have a negative impact on the humanitarian situation. But that's only part of the question. There are other parts that are very, very relevant. What's the alternative to sanctions, for example? Just total impunity. So you just go and kill whoever you want, however you like, with zero implications. I think also part of the reason why it's difficult for people to understand sanctions is that they're actually useful in only certain contexts. So they're useful if they result in behavioral change. And currently, they're not resulting in that behavioral change just because they're not being used in conjunction with other levers, so you have to use sanctions next to other tools of pressure on various actors, primarily the Syrian regime, to force it to change behavior. But currently you have the sanctions, which are basically a small stick trying to compel the Syrian regime to change behavior. It's not going to. The solution is to actually increase the level of pressure, not reduce it. And to be honest, if all we got is sanctions, if all the West is willing to invest in the Syrian conflict is sanctions, then we're actually better off without them, because they do have negative impacts. And yeah, but to me, actually, the solution is to increase the pressure, to use sanctions. And also, it's kind of interesting that people think of sanctions as a package, a one thing, but that's not the case. There are types of sanctions that have significant impacts on the population, say, for instance, the sanctions on financial transactions. These actually end up hurting everyone, and those can be lifted in exchange for political concessions. However, there are other types of sanctions that I think we should never lift because their impact on, like their side effects, are actually virtually non-existent. For example, asset freezes or travel bans. We should be using those more, not less. Finally, I just want to say, also, quite often, when you think of sanctions, many people do not appreciate the good things that sanctions have also done. For example, if it wasn't for sanctions, oil and gas off the Syrian coast, actually, the Syrian coast would actually be now extracted and exported to other countries. What's actually stopping that? There's absolutely no violence there. It's just the ocean, the sea. What's stopping that is actually sanctions. What's stopping reconstruction, which is likely to benefit regime cronies in the first instance, is sanctions. And sanctions do deserve credit in that regard.
Thank you so much. You put it very, very nicely, the negative and positive sides of sanctions. But I mean, if we are talking about how this is affecting the civilian population, I want to turn to Mark. I mean, last month, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator briefed the UN Security Council on the humanitarian situation in Syria. She stated that there are more people in need today than at any point since the start of the conflict, as Karam has already mentioned. And as I stated in the beginning, the number is 14.6 million people who are dependent on humanitarian assistance. And this is such a staggering number. And she put this into context by saying that this is 9% more than last year, and 32% more than the year before. And OCHA has recently published an excellent report on this topic as well, titled Humanitarian Needs Overview, which I highly recommend everyone to read who are watching us. So the economic and humanitarian situation is at its worst state, but the funding for assistance, as Karam already mentioned, is declining. Can you tell us, Mark, what are the reasons behind this decline, and how does this affect the humanitarian aid efforts on the ground?
Well, it's a massive crisis in Syria, and it is a crisis that has been on a downward spiral for a long time. As you've said, the situation now is worse than it's ever been. And the numbers are staggering, more than 14 million people who need humanitarian assistance to survive. And it's not only those in the country, there are millions of refugees who have fled the country. We have to remember, while we're talking about all the refugees fleeing from Ukraine at the moment. You know, the whole world is watching that situation. About 3 million have fled Ukraine so far. Remember that in the case of Syria, this conflict, this ongoing crisis has resulted in more than 13 million people who have fled their homes. About half of them are now refugees outside the country. Half of them are displaced people inside the country. So it's an absolutely massive crisis. And it is difficult to sustain the level of funding that is needed year after year. We've had a humanitarian operation which has been costing more than $2 billion a year we have been spending on humanitarian aid over the last few years. 11 years into this crisis, how do you sustain that kind of operation? In many humanitarian operations around the world, we see donor fatigue after a few years. So on the one hand, it's really just a question of, how do you keep the focus on Syria, year after year? But then on top of that, there are now so many other major humanitarian crises around the world, in places like Ukraine today, but also Afghanistan, Yemen, Ethiopia, Myanmar, and so many others, South Sudan, Somalia, Iraq, Palestine, you name it. There are so many millions of people with humanitarian needs around the world. So it's difficult to get enough funding for Syria with all these other competing needs. And, these needs have been exacerbated in Syria by further bombardment, further displacement, the overall economic decay. COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation even further. So, all of these reasons show why it's so difficult for us to get the amount of funding that is needed. Just to give you a couple of figures, 2 years ago, we appealed for about $4 billion for Syria, and we received 58% of the funding that we had requested. Last year, we received only 45% of the funding that we requested. And this year, it's quite possible that we will receive an even lower percentage. So we are extremely concerned about how people are going to be able to survive if we don't continue to get the necessary funding.
Yeah, you touched upon a number of points there, the donor fatigue, and there are other crises being across the world, and also Syrian crisis being a protracted conflict. It has been going on for so long. And when we talk about aid, we should also discuss how aid passing through Damascus is being exploited by the Syrian regime as a political instrument, rather than being delivered to Syrians who are in need of this assistance. And there are significant reports on this issue. One of them has been just recently published by Natasha Hall, named Rescuing Aid in Syria. So Karam, what are the key problems in this regard, and are there ways in which accountability and transparency can be ensured?
This is now actually well established. So we all know that aid is being siphoned off primarily by the Syrian regime, and it's being weaponized by the Syrian regime. The thing is, even though we know this, and we know all the layers like it goes through, the main actor that is in charge of doing something about it, the United Nations, is actually not doing much, not doing enough, I would say. And some of the stuff that can be done are actually quite easy to implement, like due diligence, for instance, of some contractors. Now, if I go back to your question and think of how this aid is being diverted, you think of, multiple stages, but it actually starts even from stage one, which is when money is being transferred from donor governments into Syria. It goes through the central bank, and then the central bank imposes an exchange rate that is just not fair. It's not in line with what's happening in the black market, which better reflects the fair value of the Syrian pound. And also then beyond that, it actually forces private banks to go and sell US dollars back to it, half of the amount. So they ask them to hand over half of the US dollar banknotes back to the central bank in exchange for Syrian pounds, Syrian lira. So that's the first layer. Beyond this, what happens is they impose on the UN who can enter the country and who can't. And here we all agree the UN has nothing to do about it. They can't do anything about it. But if the Syrian government is not happy with some UN officials, they just don't allow them to enter the country. And they've done this time and again, to the point where it's now known you have to behave well, otherwise you can't enter the country. The Syrian government will not allow you to enter. So that's another layer. One more layer is through preventing aid from reaching beneficiaries if that aid is being sent to besieged areas, for instance, or areas that oppose the Syrian government. So if you want to contract, if you're an NGO operating in regime-held areas, you actually have to work under the umbrella of either the Syrian Arab Red Crescent or the Syria Trust for Development, both of which are affiliated with the regime of Bashar al-Assad. So Bashar al-Assad is using this as a weapon, and we all know it. I think donor governments need to care a little bit more as to where their money is being spent, and the UN needs to take this more seriously. And just trying to stop what's happening. Stand up for the government of Syria. I mean, we did see UN officials in Ethiopia, for instance, saying, no, you're actually preventing aid from reaching Tigray region. And the day after, the government of Ethiopia listed a few people persona non grata. So they did actually stand up to them. And unfortunately, it's not happening in Syria.
Yeah, you touched upon so many points: exchange rates, the stuff being chosen, aid being diverted to some parts and others being deprived. But another very important debate about the aid is the border crossing at Bab el-Hawa. Bab el-Hawa is the only remaining crossing with a UN mandate allowing humanitarian aid to be delivered. And it is a vital lifeline for Syrians in the northwest of the country. In January, the crossing was extended for 6 months without a new vote in the UN Security Council. But there is a strong possibility that Russia could veto the resolution's renewal this coming June, especially following the developments after its attack on Ukraine. So I want to ask this question to you, Mark. What are your expectations in this regard? Because you're working on the ground there, and this Bab el-Hawa is extremely crucial. And in the case of Bab el-Hawa's closure, what could be possible alternatives to deliver aid? And are there any plans being considered at the moment?
Well, yes, we are very concerned about the risk that some Security Council members, and Russia in particular, may veto the extension of this Security Council resolution. It'll be an absolute disaster if they do veto this Security Council resolution. This resolution has been incredibly important in the Syria context. It has enabled us in the United Nations to be able to reach civilians on both sides of the front line. We have a massive aid operation. We have about 1,000 trucks a month of aid that goes across the border from Turkey into the opposition-controlled areas in northwest Syria. People are depending on this aid for their survival. And we're talking about, very vulnerable people, displaced people who are living in camps, often in appalling conditions, in tents, in the mud, in remote areas. They don't have enough health services. They don't have enough water or food. They are utterly dependent on this aid operation. And without the Security Council resolution, suddenly we will have to dismantle this operation that we've set up over the last few years. Why would we want to dismantle, an operation that is saving lives of women and children and elderly people, vulnerable people in a war zone? These are some of the most vulnerable people anywhere in the world. These are civilians who are trapped in a war zone. Why would you take away the authorization for the UN to assist these people. But yes, that is a possibility that the extension of this resolution will be vetoed. If that happens, we know that there are many non-government organizations, there are many Syrian organizations that will continue to work cross-border. But the problem is they'll be doing that without the support of the United Nations. It's not just that we're trucking aid at the moment. We've also set up a very robust monitoring mechanism. We have UN inspectors who monitor and inspect every single truck of UN aid that crosses that border. We do monitoring at the border, at the warehouses on arrival. We do monitoring at the distribution points, and then we have post-distribution monitoring mechanisms where people can call us through hotlines. They can send us WhatsApp messages. We have third-party monitors that go into northwest Syria and send us detailed reports. All of this is done because in a war zone, it's very important to prevent any diversion of humanitarian aid. We do not want this aid to be fueling this war. We want to make sure that this aid gets to the people who need it, and it does not go in any way to any of the warring parties. So why would you dismantle this very accountable and transparent mechanism that we've set up in the last few years?
Yeah, definitely. Despite the criticisms, UN are doing an amazing work in there and changing lives of so many Syrians. And I want to ask, in the same resolution, broader humanitarian assistance to Syria, including early recovery aid, was also endorsed. How does this change contribute to your efforts on the ground, particularly in terms of going beyond emergency assistance, which has been the case over the past decade? And this question is to you, Mark.
Okay, well, as you mentioned at the start, this conflict has been going on now for 11 years. This is a protracted emergency. And in this kind of protracted crisis, we do have to adapt the way we work. We cannot keep giving people aid in the same way each year. We have to try to use the funds that we have in the most efficient way. And in the case of northwest Syria, what that means for us is we have to get these people out of tents into safer and more dignified living conditions. It's absolutely shocking that 11 years into this crisis, we still have people who are living in tents, worn out tents that are not adequate to protect them from the cold in the winter. They're not suitable in the hot weather in the summer. Many of them collapse when there's heavy snow or strong winds. We have to provide better kind of shelter for these people. And it's not just shelter. Many of the hospitals and health facilities have been bombed and destroyed over the last few years. Schools have been destroyed, bakeries, kindergartens, all kinds of other infrastructure have been damaged or destroyed. And we have to adapt our programming so that instead of trucking water to people all the time, we are repairing some of the water stations and water and sewerage systems, the existing networks. It's better value for money. It's more sustainable in the long term. And then when it comes to food, we can't just keep giving people food aid. We have to help, give people more opportunities to become self-sufficient with support for livelihoods, for agriculture, for helping them in different ways to be able to have an income. So this is a standard way that we work in countries around the world. There's nothing that is particular to Syria on this. In every country, after a few years, or as soon as the situation allows, we have to move to this different kind of a focus where we look more at self-reliance and the sustainability of the aid operation.
Yeah, early recovery projects have long been supported by humanitarian circles to improve the living conditions of Syrians in a sustainable manner, as you've laid it out perfectly, Mark. However, this issue has also sparked debates, particularly in terms of who will be benefiting the most out of these initiatives and how are they going to impact the prospects of a political settlement. So I want to pose this question to Karam. Can you walk us through what are the main predicaments in this regard?
I mean, it's kind of a challenge for you to think about what happens in the near term and what happens in the long term. In the near term, do people need early recovery aid? Absolutely. They do need to rely on themselves. They need to provide for themselves. However, if this in the near term is going to empower one actor over others that has already been abusing UN aid, that is the Syrian regime, you kind of wonder what happens in the long term. So if that aid is going to be again misused by the Syrian regime and like further empowering the Syrian regime, then you wonder if Syrians will be actually better off in the long term as Bashar al-Assad solidifies his grip on power. And I'm not saying I know the answer here. It's a very, very difficult question. But luckily, I think it's not a question we need to answer at this stage because it's not something that is going to happen. What changed recently is, I mean, the UN has long been asking for early recovery aid. In fact, that cluster is the least funded cluster in the UN. However, the issue is donor governments, which happen to be predominantly Western governments, are actually not willing to fund that cluster just because they don't want things to normalize. They don't want the local actors and perhaps maybe primarily the Syrian regime to be stronger and to start thinking of the situation as that's it, that this is the new normal. Now, what happened recently is you have some concessions from the US government when it comes to sanctions, and therefore they're just making it easier to implement early recovery aid. This did change. What did not change is funding. Funding is actually on the decline. In fact, I think the UN would be struggling to meet its basic spending, let alone early recovery spending. And so I don't think anything's going to change on that front regardless.
Yeah, I want to go back to this political settlement side of it. And I know Mark has also been calling for a lasting political solution. So last December, UN Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Otto Pedersen, said there can be concrete steps taken towards the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254, which is a roadmap for peace process in Syria, calling for a fair election, a new constitution, and credible, inclusive, non-sectarian governance. He talked about the possibility of implementing a step-by-step approach. And I want to ask this to you again, Karam. Where are we in the peace process? And what is your take on step-by-step diplomacy? And do you think this could work?
So I've actually written an op-ed on this specific point with the Carnegie Endowment, and the way I look at it is there's no problem with the more for more approach. In fact, we need something to jumpstart the deadlocked political process. I think the problem happens if it's used by international actors to arrive at a face-saving settlement to the conflict. That is, just changing Resolution 2254 and just accepting a settlement that is done regardless, just let's end this conflict. And we do not want a settlement that is like what happened in Lebanon, in Al-Ta'if agreement. What happened in the early 90s was that you got warring parties to agree to a settlement where they have a power sharing system, which is basically what we might end up with if we do not have 2254 implemented genuinely. And in fact, even warring parties got money into their pockets, so to sweeten the deal for them. What we do not want in Syria is that. I think we need a genuine settlement to this conflict. And if the more for more or step for step approach is going to be used to circumvent that, then it's absolutely not the right thing to do. The risk is once you start once you start implementing this approach, the enmity actually between all parties starts to decline, and then they might actually end up accepting something that is not in line with 2254, which I think is not the right thing to do. So in short, I think we should just wait and see. There's nothing wrong with this approach, but yeah, depending on what the ultimate goal is.
Mike has been saying that in 2022, we need to see real progress in addressing humanitarian crisis and finding lasting political solutions. And I know, Mark, that you put a strong emphasis on the situation of Syrian children who are most affected by this conflict. Can you describe us the current conditions of these children? What can be done to better help them?
Well, it's appalling what's happening in Syria. It's a tragedy for everyone in the country, for elderly people, for adults, for the youth, and for the children. But it is really particularly concerning that there are so many children now who've never been to school, children who have grown up in war, who know nothing but war, and many of the youth now, they've not been to school. They've not had the advantage of being able to get an education at school, and they're very vulnerable. We know that when children are not at school, they are easily preyed on by armed groups, that try to recruit them or into their own armed forces or send them as mercenaries to other places. They offer them, money. It's hard to turn it down if you've got no other opportunities of employment. You can't go to school. You can't go to university. So, it's a real tragedy for Syria, and it's so worrying for the future of Syria and for the future of the entire region. If we don't, help these children to have a proper education, there's much more risk of radicalization, of all kinds of problems. And we've seen this in other parts of the world. We saw it in Afghanistan. We've seen it elsewhere. When you don't, invest in children who are the future of the country, you're inviting many problems for generations to come. So it's a huge problem. In Syria at the moment, there are more than 2.5 million children who are out of school. In the Idlib area in northwest Syria, more than half of the children are out of school. In the camps in northwest Syria, 90% of those camps have no school at all. So, this is a massive crisis. There are now some big campaigns around the world to try to get more children into school. One of them is called Education Cannot Wait. Another one is called No Lost Generation. But unfortunately, in Syria, we see that education is waiting. There's not enough funding for this aid operation. When we don't even have enough money to provide the food that people need, the shelters and the medical supplies that people need, then of course we're also going to find there's not nearly enough money to provide primary schools for the younger children, secondary schools, and to support them with university education. So there's a huge education crisis in Syria at the moment, and that can really be a crisis that could last for many years to come.
And I want to ask you, because we said the aid is diminishing, and you have so many projects and you have so many areas. For example, if we talk about these children, how are you going to allocate these diminishing funding? It must be very difficult.
Well, that's the job of our humanitarian workers everywhere in the world. We have to make very difficult decisions. We have to prioritize this aid. But it's interesting that in many crises around the world, in the past, we used to give priority to food and medical supplies and shelter. But if you go and ask people what they need, often they tell you that the thing we want most is education for our children. A family that has been displaced, they've lost their home, they lost their job, they've had family members that are killed. Often they feel they've lost everything, and the only thing that they can really hold on to now is their children. And their real hope is that at least their children can have a better future than they've had, a better life than they've had. They're desperate for us to help their children. They really want us to invest more in education. And so this is the challenge now. You know, a few years ago, all the member states around the world signed up to the Millennium Development Goals, and then subsequent to that, they signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. This was about, you know, trying to make sure that no one in this world goes without food and water and healthcare and education and so forth. There are such big problems now in places of conflict and instability around the world, and you know, not enough is being invested in, you know, education, clean water, healthcare, and other essential services for people in these areas of conflict and instability. We have to try to get governments to allocate more funding for this, because the current model is simply not working. We cannot just give money for emergency food aid. We have to give more money that really focuses on the dignity and worth of human beings everywhere.
Yeah, this was a fantastic and a note to end the session. Thank you very, very much for joining this session of Digital Debates. This was indeed a very comprehensive analysis of the humanitarian situation in Syria, as we touched upon a number of points. And I would like to end this session by reminding what UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths recently said: "It is not over for the Syrian people, and our responsibility is not over either." So as a closure remark, I would like to first thank our audience who were watching us today. And I would like to ask everyone, please don't forget about Syria and don't stop talking about Syrians. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.